Once upon a time, in a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills, there lived a tiny, scruffy kitten named Oliver. With fur the color of stormy clouds and eyes as wide as saucers, Oliver was the runt of the litter. Despite his small size, his heart was bursting with curiosity and a love for adventure. Oliver lived with Mrs. Henderson, a kindly old woman who had taken him in after finding him abandoned in the rain one chilly autumn evening. Mrs. Henderson's house was a warm, cozy place filled with knickknacks and the smell of fresh-baked bread. She loved Oliver, and Oliver loved her, but as fate would have it, not all stories are filled with warmth. One day, while Mrs. Henderson was out, a man knocked on her door. He was tall, with a wide grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, and he wore a suit that looked too polished for the dusty road leading to the house. His name was Mr. Sullivan, a traveling circus owner who'd heard rumors of an extraordinary kitten living in the area. According to the gossip in town, this kitten could perform tricks, jump higher than most, and had an intelligence that was far beyond what anyone had ever seen. Of course, these were just tales told by children who'd seen Oliver chase butterflies and leap into the air after moths. But to Mr. Sullivan, this sounded like a golden opportunity. When Mrs. Henderson returned that afternoon, she found Mr. Sullivan sitting in her parlor, sipping tea and making an offer she hadn't expected. "A kitten like Oliver would be a star in my circus," Mr. Sullivan said, his voice smooth as honey but sharp as a knife. "He'll live a life of fame, travel the world, and be adored by thousands." Mrs. Henderson's heart sank. She couldn't imagine parting with Oliver, her little companion. But Mr. Sullivan was persistent, painting a picture of a glamorous life where Oliver would be celebrated. He even offered her a hefty sum of money, enough to fix the leaky roof and take care of herself for years. Still, Mrs. Henderson hesitated. How could she sell Oliver to a life of the unknown where he might be mistreated or lonely? But the pressure mounted, and in a moment of weakness, she agreed. Tears welled up in her eyes as she signed the papers, her heart heavy with regret. That evening, Oliver was taken from the only home he'd ever known. The circus was a far cry from Mrs. Henderson's warm house. It was loud and chaotic, with strange smells and sounds. Oliver's tiny body shivered as he was placed in a small cage, the bars cold against his fur. He could hear the trumpeting of elephants, the roar of lions, and the laughter of clowns, but none of it made him feel any less alone. Mr. Sullivan wasted no time putting Oliver to work. Kitten was trained relentlessly, forced to jump through hoops, balance on tiny platforms, and perform tricks that only brought him pain. Each day, the tasks became more difficult, and the once adventurous kitten began to lose the sparkle in his eyes. The circus was a place of wonder for those watching, but behind the scenes, it was a world of cruelty. Oliver's paws ached, his muscles grew sore, and the small cage he lived in felt like a prison. He missed Mrs. Henderson desperately and longed for the quiet evenings spent curled up in her lap, purring as she stroked his fur. One night, after another grueling day of practice, Oliver sat in his cage, staring out at the stars above. The moon hung low in the sky, and for the first time in weeks, a feeling of hope stirred in his chest. He remembered how, as a kitten, he used to chase after fireflies in Mrs. Henderson's garden, feeling the soft grass beneath his paws and the cool breeze ruffling his fur. A tear slid down Oliver's cheek. He missed home. As the circus traveled from town to town, Oliver began to grow weaker. The excitement of performing had faded, and his once lively spirit was broken. People noticed, too. Crowds that once cheered for the tiny kitten began to dwindle. Mr. Sullivan, furious that his new star was losing its shine, grew even harsher. He shouted more, demanding perfection, but Oliver just couldn't give it anymore. Then, one fateful night, something unexpected happened. The circus had set up in a small village not far from where Mrs. Henderson lived. She had heard through the grapevine that a traveling circus was coming to town, but when she read the posters, her heart nearly stopped. There, in bright colors, was an illustration of a small kitten leaping through a flaming hoop. It was Oliver. Without a second thought, Mrs. Henderson rushed to the circus. She pushed through the crowds, her eyes darting around in search of her beloved kitten. And then, during the main event, she saw him, weak, thin, and tired, but unmistakably Oliver. He was about to perform his most dangerous trick yet, jumping through a ring of fire. Mrs. Henderson's heart raced as Oliver hesitated at the edge of the platform, his little body trembling with fear. The crowd grew impatient, but Mrs. Henderson couldn't stand it any longer. She rushed forward, shouting his name, her voice breaking through the noise of the circus. "Oliver! Oliver, come here!" At the sound of her voice, Oliver's ears perked up. His tired eyes scanned the crowd until he saw her, the one person who had loved him unconditionally. In that moment, something inside him sparked back to life. Without hesitation, Oliver bolted toward the edge of the platform, not toward the fire but toward Mrs. Henderson. Crowd gasped as Oliver leaped from the stage and ran into her waiting arms. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, his tiny body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Mr. Sullivan stormed over, furious at the interruption. "That kitten is mine. I paid for him," he shouted. But Mrs. Henderson stood tall, her voice firm. "He's not yours. He never was. He's going home where he belongs." And with that, Mrs. Henderson walked away from the circus, Oliver safely in her arms. The stars twinkled overhead as they made their way back to the little house with the leaky roof, where Oliver once again found warmth, love, and the comfort of home. No amount of money or fame could ever replace that.